Hello, little screamers, and welcome to Horror Me Softly ASMR. We start off with one of the greatest horror writers. We start off with H.P Lovecraft. Let's dive into his world and see exactly what makes him one of the greats. In the vault, there is nothing more absurd, as I view it, than that conventional association of the homely and the wholesome which seems to pervade the psychology of the multitude. Mention a bucolic Yankee setting, a bungling and thick-fibered village undertaker, and a careless mishap in a tomb. No average reader can be brought to expect more than a hearty, albeit grotesque phase of comedy. God knows, though, that the prosy tale which George Birch's death permits me to tell has in it aspects beside which some of our darkest tragedies are light. Birch acquired a limitation and changed his business in 1881. It never discussed the case when he could avoid it. Neither did his old physician, Dr. Davis, who died years ago. It was generally stated that the affliction and shock, the results of an unlucky slip whereby Birch had locked himself for 9 hours in the receiving tomb of Peck Valley Cemetery, escaping only by crude and disastrous mechanical means. But while this much was undoubtedly true, there were other and blacker things which the man used to whisper to me in his drunken delirium toward the last. He confided in me because I was his doctor, because he probably felt the need of confiding in someone else after Davis died. He was a bachelor, wholly without relatives. Birch, before 1881, had been the village undertaker of Peck Valley, and was a very calloused and primitive specimen even as such specimens go. The practices I heard attributed to him would be unbelievable today, at least in the city, and even Peck Valley would have shuddered a bit had it known the easy ethics of his mortuary artist in such matters as the ownership of costly laying out, apparel invisible beneath the casket's lid, and the degrees of dignity to be maintained in posing and adapting the unseen members of lifeless tenants to containers not always calculated with sublimest accuracy. Most distinctly, Birch was lax, insensitive, and professionally undesirable. Yet I still think he was not an evil man. He was merely crass of fiber and function, thoughtless, careless, and liquorish, as this easily avoidable accident proves, and with that modicum of imagination which holds the average citizen within certain limits fixed by taste. Just where to begin Birch's story I can hardly decide, since I am no practised teller of tales. I suppose one should start in the cold December of 1880, when the ground froze and the cemetery delvers found they could dig no more graves till spring. Fortunately, the village was small, and the death rate low, so that it was possible to give all of Birch's intimate charges a temporary haven in a single antiquated receiving tomb. The undertaker grew doubly lethargic in the bitter weather. He seemed to outdo even himself in carelessness. Never did he knock together flimsier and unganglier caskets, nor disregard more flagrantly the needs of the rusty lock on the tomb door, which he slammed open and shut with such nonchalant abandon. At last the spring thaw came, and graves were laboriously prepared for the 9 silent harvests of the grim reaper which waited in the tomb. Birch, though dreading the bother of removal and interment, began his task of transference one disagreeable April morning, but ceased before noon because of a heavy rain that seemed to irritate his horse, after having laid out but one body to its permanent rest. That was Darius Peck, the non-Nigerian, whose grave was not far from the tomb. Birch decided that he would begin the next day with little old Matthew Finner, whose grave was also nearby, but actually postponed the matter for 3 days, not getting to work until Good Friday, the 15th. Being without superstition, he did not heed the day at all, though ever afterward he refused to do anything of importance on that fateful 6th day of the week. Certainly, the events of that evening greatly changed George Birch. On the afternoon of Friday, April 15th, then, Birch set out for the tomb with horse and wagon to transfer the body of Matthew Finner. That he was not perfectly sober, he subsequently admitted, though he had not then taken to the wholesale drinking by which he later tried to forget certain things. He was just dizzy and careless enough to annoy his sensitive horse, which as he drew it viciously up at the tomb, neighed and pawed and tossed its head, much as on that former occasion when the rain had seemingly vexed it. The day was clear, but a high wind had sprung up, and Birch was glad to get to shelter as he unlocked the iron door and entered the side-hill vault. Another might not have relished the damp, odorous chamber with the 8 carelessly placed coffins, but Birch in those days was insensitive and was concerned only in getting the right coffin for the right grave. He had not forgotten the criticism aroused when Hannah Bixby's relatives, wishing to transport her body to the cemetery in the city whither they had moved, found the casket of Judge Capwell beneath her headstone. The light was dim, but Birch's sight was good, and he did not get past Vassar's coffin by mistake, although it was very similar. He had, indeed, made that coffin for Matthew Finner, but had cast it aside at last as too awkward and flimsy, and a bit of curious sentimentality aroused by recalling how kindly and generous the little old man had been to him during his bankruptcy 5 years before, and gave old Matt the very best his skill could produce, but was thrifty enough to save the rejected specimen, and to use it when Asaph Sawyer died of a malignant fever. Sawyer was not a lovable man, and many stories were told of his almost inhuman vindictiveness and tenacious memory for wrongs real or fancied. To him Birch had felt no compunction in assigning the carelessly made coffin, which he now pushed out of the way in his quest for the Finner casket. It was just as he had recognized old Matt's coffin that the door slammed to in the wind, leaving him in a dusk even deeper than before. The narrow transom admitted only the feeblest rays, and overhead ventilation funneled virtually none at all, so that he was reduced to profane fumbling as he made his halting way among the long boxes toward the latch. In this funeral twilight he rattled the rusty handles, pushed at the iron panels, and wondered why the massive portal had grown so suddenly recalcitrant. In this twilight, too, he began to realize the truth and to shout loudly, as if his horse was outside could do more than neigh an unsympathetic reply. For the long-neglected latch was obviously broken, leaving the careless undertaker trapped in the vault, a victim of his own oversight. The thing must have happened at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Birch, being by temperament phlegmatic and practical, did not shout long, but proceeded to grope about for some tools which he recalled seeing in a corner of the tomb. It is doubtful whether he was touched at all by the horror and exquisite weirdness of his position, but the bald fact of imprisonment so far from the daily paths of men was enough to exasperate him thoroughly. His day's work was sadly interrupted, and unless chance presently brought some rambler hither, he might have to remain all night or longer. The pile of tools soon reached, and a hammer and a chisel selected. Birch returned over the coffins to the door. The air had begun to be exceedingly unwholesome, but to this detail he paid no attention as he toiled, half by feeling, at the heavy and corroded metal of the latch. He would have given much for a lantern or a bit of candle, but, lacking these, bungled semi-sightlessly as best he might. When he perceived that the latch was hopelessly unyielding, at least to such meager tools and under such tenebrous conditions as these, Birch glanced about for other possible points of escape. The vault had been dug from a side hill, so that the narrow ventilation funnel in the top ran through several feet of earth, making this direction utterly useless to consider. Over the door, however, the high, slit-like transom in the brick facade gave promise of possible enlargement to a diligent worker. Hence upon this his eyes long rested as he racked his brain for means to reach it. There was nothing like a ladder in the tomb, and the coffin niches on the sides and the rear, which Birch seldom took the trouble to use, afforded no ascent to the space above the door. Only the coffins themselves remained as potential stepping stones, and as he considered these, he speculated on the best mode of arranging them. 3 coffin heights, he reckoned, would permit him to reach the transom, but he could do better with 4. The boxes were fairly even, and they could be piled up like blocks. So he began to compute how he might most stably use the 8 to rear a scalpable platform 4 deep. As he planned, he could not but wish that the units of his contemplated staircase had been more securely made. Whether he had imagination enough to wish they were empty is strongly to be doubted. Finally, he decided to lay a base of 3 parallel with the wall, to place upon this 2 layers of 2 each, and upon these a single box to serve as the platform. This arrangement could be ascended with a minimum of awkwardness, and would furnish the desired height. Better still, though, he would utilize only 2 boxes of the base to support the superstructure, leaving 1 free to be piled on in top, in case the actual feat of escape required an even greater altitude. And so the prisoner toiled in the twilight, heaving the unresponsive remnants of mortality with little ceremony as his miniature tower of Babel rose course by course. Several of the coffins began to split under the stress of handling, and he planned to save the stoutly built casket of little Matthew Fenner for the top, in order that his feet might have as certain a surface as possible. In the semi-gloom he trusted mostly to touch to select the right one, and indeed came upon it almost by accident, since it tumbled into his hands as if through some odd volition after he had unwittingly placed it beside another on the 3rd layer. The tower at length finished, and his aching arms rested by a pause during which he sat on the bottom step of his grim device. Birch cautiously ascended with his tools and stood abreast of the narrow transom. The borders of the space were entirely of brick. There seemed little doubt but that he could shortly chisel away enough to allow his body to pass. As his hammer blows began to fall, the horse outside whinnied in a tone which may have been encouraging and may have been mocking. In either case, it would have been appropriate, for the unexpected tenacity of the easy-looking brickwork was surely a sardonic commentary on the vanity of mortal hopes, and the source of a task whose performance deserved every possible stimulus. Dusk fell and found Birch still toiling. They worked largely by feeling now, since newly gathered clouds hid the moon, and the progress was still slow. He felt heartened at the extent of his encroachments on the top and bottom of the aperture. He could, he was sure, get out by midnight, though it is characteristic of him that this thought was untinged with eerie implications. Undisturbed by oppressive reflections on the time, the place, and the company beneath his feet, he philosophically chipped away the stony brickwork, cursing when a fragment hit him in the face, and laughing when one struck the increasingly excited horse that pawed near the cypress tree. In time the hole grew so large that he ventured to try his body in it now and then, shifting about so that the coffins beneath him rocked and creaked. He would not, he found, have to pile another on his platform to make the proper height, for the hole was on exactly the right level to use as soon as its size would permit. Must have been midnight at least when Birch decided he could get through the transom. Tired and perspiring despite many rests, he descended to the floor and sat along the bottom box to gather strength for the final wiggle and leap to the ground outside. The hungry horse was neighing repeatedly and almost uncannily, and he vaguely wished it would stop. He was curiously unelated over his impending escape, and almost dreaded the exertion, for his form had the indolent stoutness of early middle age. As he remounted the splitting coffins, he felt his weight very poignantly, especially when, upon reaching the topmost one, he heard that aggravated crackle which bespeaks the wholesale winding of wood. He had, it seems, planned in vain when choosing the stoutest coffin for the platform, for no sooner was his full bulk again upon it than the rotting lid gave way, jouncing him 2 feet down on a surface which even he did not care to imagine. Maddened by the sound, or by the stench which bellowed forth even to the open air, the waiting horse gave a scream that was too frantic for a neigh, and plunged madly up through the night, the wagon rattling crazily behind it. Birch, in his ghastly situation, was now too low for an easy scramble out of the enlarged transom, but gathered his energies for a determined try. Clutching the edges of the aperture, he sought to pull himself up, when he noticed a queer retardation in the form of an apparent drag on both his ankles. In another moment he knew fear for the first time that night. For struggle as he would, he could not shake clear of the unknown grasp which held his feet in relentless captivity. Horrible pains, as of savage wounds, shot through his calves, and in his mind was a vortex of fright, mixed with an unquenchable materialism that suggested splinters, loose nails, or some other attribute of the breaking wooden box. Perhaps he screamed. At any rate, he kicked and squirmed frantically and automatically whilst his consciousness was almost eclipsed in a half-swoon. Instinct guided him in this wiggle through the transom, and in the crawl which followed his jarring thud on the damp ground. He could not walk, it appeared, and the emerging moon must have witnessed a horrible sight as he dragged his bleeding ankles toward the cemetery lodge, his fingers clawing the black mold in brainless haste, and his body responding with that madness from which one suffers when chased by the phantoms of nightmare. There was evidently, however, no pursuer, for he was alone and alive with Armington, the lodge-keeper, responded to his feeble clawing at the door. Armington helped Birch to the outside of his spare bed and sent his little son Edwin for Dr. Davis. The afflicted man was fully conscious, but would say nothing of any consequence, merely muttering such things as, "Oh, my ankles! Let go!" or "Shut in the tomb." Then the doctor came with his medicine case and asked crisp questions, and removed the patient's outer clothing, shoes, and socks. The wounds, for both ankles were frightfully lacerated about the Achilles tendons, seemed to puzzle the old physician greatly, and finally almost to frighten him. His questions grew more than medically tense. His hands shook as he dressed the mangled members, binding them as if he wished to get the wounds out of sight as quickly as possible. For an impersonal doctor, Davis's ominous and awestruck cross-examination became very strange indeed as he sought to drain from the weakened undertaker every last detail of his horrible experience. He was oddly anxious to know if Birch was sure, absolutely sure, of the identity of that top coffin of the pile, how he had chosen it, how he had been certain of it as the thinner coffin in the dark, and how he had distinguished it from the inferior duplicate coffin of vicious Asaph Sawyer. Would the firm thinner casket have caved in so readily? Davis, an old-time village practitioner, had of course seen both at their respective funerals, as indeed he had attended both Benner and Sawyer in their last illnesses. He had even wondered, at Sawyer's funeral, how the vindictive farmer had managed to lie straight in a box so closely akin to that of the diminutive Finner. After a full 2 hours, Dr. Dave slept, urging Birch to insist at all times that his wounds were due entirely to loose nails and splintering wood. What else, he added, could ever in any case be proved or believed? But it would be well to say as little as he could be said, and to let no other doctor treat the wounds. Birch heeded this advice all the rest of his life until he told me a story, and when I saw the scars, ancient and whitened as they then were, I agreed that he was wise in doing so. He always remained lame, but the great tendons had been severed. But I think the greatest lameness was in his soul, his thinking processes. One so phlegmatic and logical had become ineffaceably scarred. It was pitiful to note his reaction to certain chance allusions such as Friday, tomb, coffin, and words of less obvious concatenation. His frightened horse had gone home, but his frightened wits never quite did that. He changed his business. Something always preyed upon him. It may have been just fear, and it may have been fear mixed with a queer, belated sort of remorse for bygone gritty days. His drinking, of course, only aggravated what he sought to alleviate. When Dr. Davis left Birch that night, he had taken a lantern and gone to the old receiving tomb. The moon was shining on the scattered brick fragments and marred the cage, and the latch of the great door yielded readily to a touch from the outside. Steeled by old ordeals and dissecting rooms, the doctor entered and looked about, stifling the nausea of mind and body that everything in sight and smell induced. He cried aloud once, and a little later gave a gasp that was more terrible than a cry. Then he fled back to the lodge and broke all the rules of his calling by rousing and shaking his patient, hurling at him a succession of shuddering whispers that seared into the bewildered ears like the hissing of a vitriol. It was the sap's coffin, Birch, just as I thought. I knew his teeth, with the front ones missing on the upper jaw. Never, for God's sake, show these wounds. The body was pretty badly gone, but if ever I saw vindictiveness on any face, former face, you know what a friend he was for revenge. How he ruined old Raymond 30 years after their boundary suit, and how he stepped on the puppy that snapped at him a year ago last August. He was the devil incarnate, Birch, and I believe his eye-born-eyed fury could beat time and death. God, his rage! I'd hate to have it aimed at me. Why did you do it, Birch? He was a scoundrel, and I don't blame you for giving him a cast-aside coffin. He always did go too damn far. Well enough to skimp on the thing in some way, but you know what a little man old Finner was. I'll never get the picture out of my head as long as I live. You kicked hard. First his coffin was on the floor, his head was broken in, and everything was tumbled about. I've seen sights before, but there was one thing too much here. An eye for an eye. Great heavens, Birch, but you got what you deserved. The skull turned my stomach. The other was worse. Those ankles cut nearly off to fit Matt Finner's cast-aside coffin. And that concludes the vault. An eye for an eye. Shall we move on to the next? On to Pickman's model. I think we shall. You needn't think I'm crazy, Elio. Plenty of others have queerer prejudices than this. Why don't you laugh at Oliver's grandfather, who won't ride in a motor? If I don't like that damned subway, it's my own business. And we got here more quickly anyhow in the taxi. We'd have had to walk up the hill from Park Street if we'd taken the car. I know I'm more nervous than I was when you saw me last year. You don't need to hold a clinic over it. There's plenty of reason, God knows. I fancy I'm lucky to be sane at all. Why the third degree? You didn't used to be so inquisitive. Well, you must hear it. I don't know why you shouldn't. Maybe you ought to, anyhow, for you kept writing me like a grieved parent when you heard I'd begun to cut the art club and keep away from Pickman. Now that he's disappeared, I go around to the club once in a while, though my nerves aren't what they were. No, I don't know what's become of Pickman, and I don't like to guess. You might have surmised I had some inside information when I dropped him, and that's why I don't want to think where he's gone. Let the police find what they can. It won't be much, judging from the fact that they don't know yet of the old North End place he hired under the name of Peters. I'm not sure that I could find it again myself, not that I'd ever try, even in broad daylight. Yes, I do know, or am afraid I know, why he maintained it. I'm coming to that, and I think you'll understand before I'm through why I don't tell the police. They would ask me to guide them, but I couldn't go back there even if I knew the way. There was something there, and now I can't use the subway, and you may as well have your laugh at this too, go down into cellars anymore. I should think you'd have known I didn't drop Pickman, for the same silly reasons that fussy old women like Dr. Reed or Joe Minot or Rossworth did. Morbid art doesn't shock me, and when a man has the genius Pickman had, I feel it an honor to know him, no matter what direction his work takes. Austin never had a greater painter than Richard Upton Pickman. I said it at first, and I say it still, and I never swerved an inch either, when he showed that cool feeding. That, you remember, was when Minot cut him. You know, it takes profound art and profound insight into nature to turn out stuff like Pickman's. Any magazine cover hack can splash paint around wildly and call it a nightmare or a witch's Sabbath, or a portrait of the devil. But only a great painter can make such a thing really scare, or ring true. That's because only a real artist knows the actual anatomy of the terrible, or the physiology of fear. The exact sort of lines and proportions that connect up with latent instincts, hereditary memories of fright, and the proper color contrasts and lighting effects disturb the dormant sense of strangeness. I don't have to tell you why a Fuseli really brings a shiver, while a cheap ghost story front a piece merely makes us laugh. There's something those fellows catch beyond life, that they're able to make us catch for a second. Doré had it, Sime had it, and Galula of Chicago has it. Pickman had it as no man ever had it before, or, oh to heaven, ever will again. Don't ask me what it is they see. You know, in ordinary art, there's all the difference in the world between the vital, breathing things drawn from nature and models, and the artificial trap that commercial small fry reel off in a bare studio by rule. Well, I should say that the really weird artist has a kind of vision which makes models, or summons up what amounts to actual scenes from the spectral world he lives in. Anyhow, he manages to turn out results that differ from the pretender's mince pie dreams, just about the same way that the life painter's results differ from the concoctions of a correspondence school cartoonist. If I had ever seen what Pickman saw, and no, here, let's have a drink before we get deeper. Glad I wouldn't be alive if I'd ever seen what that man, if he was a man, saw. You recall that Pickman's forte was faces. I don't believe anybody since Gloria could put so much of sheer hell into a set of features or a twist of expression. And before Gloria, you had to go back to the medieval chaps, to the gargoyles and chimeras of Notre Dame and Mont Saint Michael. They believed all sorts of things, and maybe they saw all sorts of things too, but the Middle Ages had some curious phases. I remember you asking Pickman yourself once, the year before you went away, wherever in thunder he got such ideas and visions. Wasn't that a nasty laugh he gave you? It was partly because of that laugh that Reed dropped him. Reed, you know, just taken up comparative pathology was full of pompous inside stuff. But the biological or evolutionary significance of this or that mental or physical symptom, He said Pigman repelled him more and more every day, and almost frightened him toward the last. That the fellow's features and expression were slowly developing in a way he didn't like, in a way that wasn't human. He had a lot of talk about diet, that Pigman must be abnormal and eccentric to the last degree. I suppose he told Reed, if you and he had any correspondence over it, that he'd let Pigman's paintings get on his nerves or harrow up his imagination. I know I told him that myself then. But keep in mind that I didn't drop Pigman for anything like this. On the contrary, my admiration for him kept growing, but that goal fading was a tremendous achievement. As you know, the club wouldn't exhibit it, and the Museum of Fine Arts wouldn't accept it as a gift, and I can add that nobody would buy it. So Pigman had it right in his house till he went. Now his father has it in Salem. You know, Pigman comes of old Salem stock, and had his witch ancestor hanged in 1692. I got into the habit of calling on Pigman quite often, especially after I began making notes for a monograph on weird art. Probably this work which put the idea into my head, and anyhow, I found him a mine of data and suggestions when I came to develop it. He showed me all the paintings and drawings he had about, including some pen and ink sketches that would, I verily believe, have gotten kicked out of the club if many of the members had seen them. Before long, it was pretty nearly devoted. I would listen for hours like a schoolboy to art theories and philosophic speculations wild enough to qualify him for the Danvers Asylum. My hero worship, coupled with the fact that people generally were convincing to have less and less to do with him, made him get very confidential with me. One evening he hinted that if I were fairly close-mouthed and none too squeamish, he might show me something rather unusual, something a bit stronger than anything he had in the house. You know, he said, there are things that won't do for Newbury Street, things that are out of place here, and that can't be conceived here, anyhow. It's my business to catch the overtones of the soul, and you won't find those in a parvenu set of artificial streets on Maidland. Back Bay isn't Boston. It isn't anything yet, because it's had no time to pick up memories and attract local spirits. If there are any ghosts here, they're the tame ghosts of Salt Marsh and Shallow Cove. And I want human ghosts, ghosts of beings highly organized, enough to have looked on hell and known the meaning of what they saw. The place for an artist to live is in the North End. Any if they were sincere, you put up with the slums for the sake of the mass traditions. God, man, don't you realize places like that weren't merely made, but actually grew? Generation after generation lived and felt and died there, and in days when people weren't afraid to live and feel and die. Don't you know there was a mill in Copp's Hill in 1632, that half the present streets were laid out by 1650? I can show you houses that have stood 2 centuries and a half and more, houses that have witnessed what would make a modern house crumble into powder. What do moderns know of life and the forces behind it? You call Salem witchcraft a delusion. But I'll wager my 4 times great-grandmother could have told you things. They hanged her on Gallows Hill, with Cotton Mather looking sanctimoniously on. Mather, damn him, was afraid somebody might succeed in kicking free of this accursed cage of the monotony. I wish someone had laid a spell on him or sucked his blood in the night. I can show you a house he lived in, and I can show you another one he was afraid to enter in spite of all his fine, bold talk. He knew things he didn't dare put into that stupid Magnalia or that hero wonders of the invisible world. Look here. You know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with each other's houses, burying ground in the sea, and persecute above ground. Things went on every day that they couldn't reach, voices laughed at night that they couldn't place. Why, then, out of 10 surviving houses built before 1700, not moved since, I'll wager that an 8, I can show you something queer in the cellar. Surely a month that you don't read of workmen finding bricked up arches, wells leading nowhere in this or that old place as it comes down. You could see one near Henchman Street from elevated last year. There are witches, and with their spells summoned, pirates, and what they brought in from the sea, smugglers, privateers, and I tell you, people knew how to live, how to enlarge the bounds of life in the old time. This wasn't the only world a bold and wise man could know. Ha! And to think of today in contrast, with such pale pink brains that even the club's supposed artists, his shudders and convulsions if a picture goes beyond the feelings of a Beacon Street tea table. The only saving grace of the present is that it's too damn stupid to question the past very closely. Do maps and records and guidebooks really tell of the North End? Bah! I guess I'll guarantee to lead you to 30 or 40 alleys and networks of alleys north of Prince Street that aren't suspected by 10 living beings outside of the foreigners that swarm them. But what do these Dagos know of their meaning? No, Thurber, these ancient places are dreaming, gorgeously and overflowing with wonder and terror and escapes from the commonplace. And yet there's not a living soul to understand or profit by it. Or rather, there's only one living soul, for I haven't been digging around in the past for nothing. See here? You're interested in this sort of thing. What if I told you that I've got another studio up there, where I can catch the night spirit of antique horror, paint things I couldn't even think of in Newbury Street? Naturally, I don't tell those cursed old maids at the club. With Reed, damn him, whispering as it is that I'm a sort of monster bound down the toboggan of reverse evolution. Yes, Thurber, I decided long ago that one must paint terror as well as beauty from life, so I did some exploring in places where I had reason to know terror lives. Got a place I don't believe 3 living Nordic men besides myself have ever seen. It isn't so very far from elevated as distance goes, but as centuries away as the soul goes. I took it because of the queer old bricks well in the cellar, one of the sort I told you about. The shack's almost tumbling down so that nobody else will live there, and I'd hate to tell you how little I pay for it. The windows are boarded up, but I like that all the better, since I don't want daylight for what I do. I paint in the cellar, where the inspiration is thickest, but I have other rooms furnished on the ground floor. But Cecilia knows it, and I've hired it under the name of Peters. Now, if you're game, I'll take you there tonight. I think you enjoy the pictures, for as I said, I've let myself go a bit there. It's no fast tour. I sometimes do it on foot, for I don't want to attract attention with a taxi in such a place. You can take a shuttle at the South Station for Battery Street, and after that walk isn't much. Well, Elliot, there wasn't much for me to do after that harangue, but to keep myself from running instead of walking for the first vacant cab we could sight. We changed to the elevated at the South Station, and about 12 o'clock climbed down the steps at Battery Street, struck along the old waterfront past Constitution Wharf. I didn't keep track of the cross streets, and can't tell you yet which it was we turned up, but I know it was in Greenhow Lane. When we did turn, it was to climb through the deserted length of the oldest, dirtiest alley I ever saw in my life. Crumbling-looking gables, broken small-pane windows, the archaic chimneys that stood out half disintegrated against the moonlit sky. I don't believe there were 3 houses in sight that hadn't been standing in Cotton Mather's time. Certainly I glimpsed at least 2 with an overhang. Once I thought I saw a peaked roof line, the almost forgotten pre-gamble type, though antiquarians tell us there are none left in Boston. From that alley, which had a dim light, we turned to the left into an equally silent and still narrow alley with no light at all. In a minute made what I think was an obtuse angled bend toward the right in the dark. Not long after this, Pigman produced a flashlight and revealed an anti-defolium tin-paneled door that looked damnably wormy. Unlocking it, he ushered me into a barren hallway with what was once splendid dark oak paneling. Simple, of course, thrillingly suggestive of the times of Andros and Phipps and the witchcraft. Then he took me to a door on the left, lighted an oil lamp, and told me to make myself at home. Now, Elliot, I'm what the man in the street would call fairly hard-boiled. I'll confess that what I saw on the walls of that room gave me a bad turn. They were his pictures, you know, the ones he couldn't paint or even show in new very shaped. And he was right when he said he had let himself go. Here, have another drink. I need one anyhow. There's no use in my trying to tell you what they were like, because the awful, the blasphemous horror, and the unbelievable lonesomeness more of what came from simple touches quite beyond the power of words to classify. There was none of the exotic technique you see in Sydney Sam, none of that trans-Saturnian landscapes and lunar fungi that Clark Ashton Smith uses to freeze. He uses to freeze the blood. The backgrounds were mostly old churchyards, deep woods, cliffs by the sea, brick tunnels, ancient paneled rooms, or simple vaults of masonry. Topsail burying ground, which could not be many blocks away from this very house, was a favorite scene. The madness and monstrosity lay in the figures in the foreground, for Pigman's morbid art was preeminently one of demonic portraiture. His figures were seldom completely human, but often approached humanity in varying degree. Most of the bodies, while roughly bipedal, had a forward slumping and vaguely canine cast. The texture of the majority was a kind of unpleasant rubberiness. Ugh, I can see them now. Their occupations. Well, don't ask me to be too precise. They were usually feeding. I won't say on what. They were sometimes shown in groups in cemeteries or underground passages, and often appeared to be in battle over their prey, or rather, their treasure trove. What damnable expressiveness Pigman sometimes gave the slightest basis of this charnel booty. Occasionally, the things were shown leaping open windows at night, or squatting on the chests of sleepers, whirring at their throats. One canvas showed a ring of them, baying about a hanged witch on Gallows Hill, whose dead face held a close kinship to theirs. Don't get the idea that it was all this hideous business of theme and setting which struck me faint. I'm not a 3-year-old kid, and I'd seen much like this before. It was the faces, Elliot. Those accursed faces. That leered and slithered out of the canvas with the very breath of life. By God, man, I barely believed they were alive. That nauseous wizard, like the fires of hell and Pigment, and his brush had been a nightmare spawning wand. Give me that decanter, Elliot. There was one thing called the lesson. Heaven pity me that I ever saw it. Listen. Can you fancy a squatting circle of nameless dog-like things in a churchyard, teaching a small child how to be like themselves? The price of a changeling, I suppose. You know, the old myth about how the weird people leave their spawn in cradles in exchange for the human babes they steal. Pigman was showing what happens to those stolen babies, how they grow up, and then I began to see a hideous relationship in the faces of the human and non-human figures. He was, in all his gradations of morbidity, between the frankly non-human and the degradably human, establishing a sardonic linkage in evolution. The dog things were developed from mortals. No sooner had I wondered what he made of their own young as left with mankind in the form of changelings, and my eye caught a picture embodying that very thought. It was that of an ancient Puritan interior, a heavily beamed room with lattice windows, a settle, and clumsy 17th century furniture, with the family sitting about while the father read from the scriptures. Every face but one showed nobility and reverence. That one reflected the mockery of the pit. It was that of a young man in years, no doubt belonged to a supposed son of that pious father, but in essence it was the kin of unclean things. It was their changeling, and in a spirit of supreme irony, Pickman had given the features a very perceptible resemblance to his own. By this time Pickman had lighted a lamp in an adjoining room and was politely holding open the door for me, asking me if I would care to see his modern studies. I hadn't been able to give him much of my opinions. I was too speechless with fright and loathing, but I think he fully understood and felt highly complimented. And now I want to assure you again, Elliot, that I'm no mollycoddle to scream at anything that shows a bit of departure from the usual. I'm middle-aged and decently sophisticated, and I guess you saw enough of me in France to know I'm not easily knocked out. Remember, too, that I just about recovered my wind had gotten used to those frightful pictures which turned colonial New England to a kind of annex of hell. Well, in spite of all this, that next room forced a real scream out of me, and I had to clutch at the doorway to keep from keeling over. The other chamber had shown a pack of ghouls and witches overrunning the world of our forefathers, but this one brought the horror right into our own daily life. Gad, how that man could paint! There was a study called Subway Accident, in which a flock of the vile things were clambering up from some unknown catacomb through a crack in the floor of the Boylston Street subway and attacking a crowd of people on the platform. Another showed a dance on Copp's Hill among the tombs with the background of today. And there were any number of cellar views, with monsters creeping in through holes and rifts in the masonry, and grinning as they squatted behind barrels or furnaces and waited for their first victim to descend the stairs. One disgusting canvas seemed to depict a vast cross-section of Beacon Hill, with ant-like armies of the mephic monsters squeezing themselves through burrows that honeycombed in the ground. Dances in the modern cemeteries were freely pictured, and another conception somehow shocked me more than all the rest. A scene in an unknown vault, where scores of the beasts crowded about one who held a well-known Boston guidebook and was evidently reading aloud. All were pointing to a certain passage, and every face seemed so distorted with epileptic and reverberant laughter that I almost thought I heard fiendish echoes. The title of the picture was Holmes, Lowell, and Longfellow Lie Buried in Mount Auburn. As I gradually steadied myself and got readjusted to the second room of delivery of deviltry and morbidity, I began to analyze some of the points in my sickening loathing. In the first place, I said to myself, these things repel because of the utter inhumanity and callous cruelty they showed in Pickman. The fellow must be a relentless enemy of all mankind to take such glee in the torture of brain and flesh, and the degradation of the mortal tenement. In the second place, they terrified because of their very greatness. Their art was the art that convinced. When we saw the pictures, we saw the demons themselves and were afraid of them. And the queer part was that Pickman got none of his power from the use of selectiveness or bizarre. Nothing was blurred, distorted, or conventionalized. Outlines were sharp and lifelike, and details were almost painfully defined. And the faces! It was not any mere artist's interpretation that we saw. It was pandemonium itself, crystal clear and stark objectivity. That was said, by heaven! The man was not a fantasticist or romanticist at all. He did not even try to give us the churning, prismatic ephemera of dreams, but coldly and sardonically reflected some stable, canonistic, and well-established horror world, which he saw fully, brilliantly, squarely, and unfalteringly. God knows what that world can have been, or where he ever glimpsed the blasphemous shapes that loped and trotted and crawled through it. But whatever the baffling source of his images, one thing was plain. Hickman was in every sense, in conception and in execution, a thorough, painstaking, and almost scientific realist. My host was now leading the way down cellar to his actual studio, and I braced myself for some hellish effects among the unfinished canvases. As we reached the bottom of the damp stairs, he turned his flashlight to a corner of the large open space at hand, revealing the circular brick curve of what was evidently a great well in the earthen floor. We walked nearer, and I saw that it must be 5 feet across, the walls a good foot thick, some 6 inches above the ground level. Solid work of the 17th century, or I was much mistaken. That, Hickman said, was the kind of thing he had been talking about, an aperture of the network of tunnels that used to undermine the hill. I noticed finally that it did not seem to be bricked up, that a heavy disk of wood formed the apparent cover. Thinking of the things this well must have been connected with, Hickman's wild hints had not been mere rhetoric. I shivered slightly, and turned to follow him up the step, through a narrow door into a room of fair size, provided with a wooden floor, furnished as a studio, and as my guest's outfit gave the light necessary for work. The unfinished pictures on easels propped against the walls were as ghastly as the finished ones upstairs, and showed the painstaking methods of the artist. The scenes were blocked out with extreme care, and penciled guidelines told of the minute exactitude which Hickman used getting the right perspective and proportions. The mail was great. I see it even now, knowing as much as I do. A large camera on a table excited my notice. Hickman told me that he used it taking scenes for backgrounds, so that he might paint them from photographs in studio instead of carting his outfit around the town for this or that view. He thought a photograph quite as good as an actual scene or model for sustained work, declared he employed them regularly. There was something very disturbing about the nauseous sketches and half-finished monstrosities that leered around every side of the room. When Hickman suddenly unveiled a huge canvas on the side away from the light, I could not for my life keep back a loud scream. The second I admitted that night, it echoed through the dim vaultings of that ancient and nitrous cellar, and I had to choke back a flood of reaction that threatened to burst out as hysterical laughter. Merciful Creator, Elliot, but I don't know how much was real and how much was feverish fancy. It doesn't seem to me that Earth can hold a dream like that. It was a colossal, nameless blasphemy with glaring red eyes, and it held in bony claws a thing that had been a man, gnawing at the head as a child nibbles at a stick of candy. Its position was a kind of crouch, and as one looked one felt that at any moment it might drop its present prey and seek a juicier morsel. But damn it all, it wasn't even the fiendish subject that made it such an immortal fountainhead of all panic. Not that, nor the dog face with its pointed ears, bloodshot eyes, flat nose, and drooling lips. It wasn't the scaly claws, nor the mold-cake body, nor the half-hooked feet. None of these, though any of them might well have driven an excitable man to madness. It was the technique, Elliot. The cursed, the impious, the unnatural technique. As I am a living being, I never elsewhere saw the actual breath of life so fused into a canvas. The monster was there, glared, gnawed, and glared, and I knew that only a suspension of nature's laws could ever let a man paint a thing like that without a model, without some glimpse of the nether world which no mortal unsold to the fiend has ever had. And with the thumb tacked to a vacant part of the canvas was a piece of paper now badly curled up. Probably, I thought, a photograph from which Hickman meant to paint a background as hideous as the nightmare it was to enhance. I reached out to uncurl and look at it. Then suddenly I saw Pigman start as if shot. He had been listening with peculiar intensity ever since my shocked scream had waked unaccustomed echoes in the dark cellar, and now he seemed struck with a fright which, though not comparable to my own, added in more of the physical than of the spiritual. He drew a revolver and motioned me to silence, stepped out into the main cellar and closed the door behind him. I think I was paralyzed for an instant, imitating Pigman's listening. I fancied I heard a faint scurrying sound somewhere, a series of squeals or beats in a direction I couldn't determine. I thought of huge rats and shuddered. Then there came a subdued sort of clatter, which somehow set me all in goose flesh, a furtive, groping kind of clatter, though I can't attempt to convey what I mean in words. It's like heavy wood falling on stone or brick. Wood on brick. What did that make me think of? It came again, and louder. There was a vibration as if the wood had fallen farther than it had fallen before. After that followed a sharp grating noise, a shouted gibberish from Pigman, a deafening discharge of all 6 chambers of a revolver, fired spectacularly as a lion tamer might fire in the air for effect. A muffled squeal or squawk, and a thud. And more wood and brick grating, a pause, and the opening of a door, at which I'll confess I started violently. Pigman reappeared with his smoking weapon, cursing the bloated rats that infested the ancient well. The deuce knows what they eat, Thurber, he grinned. For those archaic tunnels touch graveyard and witch den and seacoast. But whatever it is, they must have run short, for they were devilish anxious to get out. Your yelling stirred them up, I fancy. Better be cautious in the old places. Our rodent friends are the one drawbacks, though I sometimes think they're a positive asset by way of atmosphere and color. Well, Elliot, that was the end of the night's adventure. Pigman had promised to show me the place, and heaven knows he had done it. He led me out of that tangle of alleys in another direction, it seems. For when we sighted a lamppost, we were in a half-familiar street with monotonous rows of mingled tenement blocks and old houses. Charter Street turned out to be, but I was too flustered to notice just where we hit it. We were too late for the elevated, and walked back downtown through Havner Street. I remember that walk. We switched from Tremont up Beacon. Pigman left me at the corner of Joy, where I turned off. I never spoke to him again. Why did I drop him? Don't be impatient. Wait till I ring for coffee. I've had enough of the other stuff, but I for one need something. No, it wasn't paintings I saw in that place, though I'll swear they are enough to get him ostracized in 9/10 of the homes and clubs of Boston, and I guess you won't wonder now why I have to steer clear of subways and cellars. It was something I found in my coat the next morning. You know, curls of paper tacked to that frightful canvas in the cellar. Thing I thought was a photograph of some scene he meant to use as a background for that monster. That last scare had come while I was reaching to uncurl it, and it seems I had vacantly crumpled it into my pocket. But here's the coffee. Take it back, Elliot, if you're wise. Yes, that paper was the reason I dropped Pigman. Richard Upton Pigman, the greatest artist I have ever known, and the foulest being that ever leaped the bounds of life into the pits of myth and madness. Elliot, old Reed was right. He wasn't strictly human. Either he was born in strange shadow, or he found a way to unlock the forbidden gate. It's all the same now, for he's gone, back into the fabulous darkness he left to haunt. Here, let's have the chandelier going. Don't ask me to explain or even conjecture about what I burned. Don't ask me either what lay behind that mole-like scrambling Pigman was so keen to pass off as rats. There are secrets, which might have come down from old Salem times. And Cotton Mather tells even stranger things. How damned lifelike Pigman's paintings were. How we all wondered where he got those faces. Well, that paper wasn't a photograph of any background, after all. What it showed was simply the monstrous being he was painting on that awful canvas. It was the model he was using, and his background was merely the wall of the cellar studio, in minute detail. But by God, Elliot, it was a photograph from life.